Hey everyone, we're back. Welcome to the Season 10 premiere of The Walking Dead. I don't think I have to tell you, but if you haven't seen the Season 10 opening episode yet, this video is going to have a lot of spoilers. If you don't want anything ruined, I thank you for checking this out and come back after you watched it for all the comic insights. Before you go, hit that subscribe button and make sure to check out some of my other videos. This season appears to be going in a new style in terms of how these episodes play out. This episode is titled Lines We Cross and is a reference to a later issue in the comics, but more on that later. The show starts out with all the survivors on the beach, training in preparation for the Whisperers. While not directly said, it's implied multiple times throughout the episode that there's been at least several months since the Whisperers have last been seen, and the community seemed to be living in a constant state of paranoia and fear. Now, we don't know if the training's to actually prepare them to fight the Whisperers, or if it's just something to keep their minds busy and off the looming threat outside the walls. After the training session is done for the day, the group heads back to Oceanside, where Judith sees one of the other children has found a skin mask. This is where the show breaks off into multiple scenarios, with the first being right there at Oceanside. Michonne and the others decide not to tell anyone so they don't cause a panic, but instead send out some scouts to look for more signs of the Whisperers, which they find at a camp. A skin suit is seen among several bodies, given the second indication the Whisperers may have returned. They head back to Oceanside to decide how to handle this, at which time a loud boom is heard, followed by a fireball in the sky. Next scenario is at Alexandria, with Eugene taking care of Rosita's baby while she's busy with a training montage. Gabriel gets a radio transmission from Oceanside telling him about the Whisperers. He calls a council meeting and kicks Lydia out, but she overhears what's going on in Oceanside. She runs into Negan, who is on work release, and advises her that when people are on alert like this, she better watch her back.
It means watch your back, kid.
Later in his cell, Negan has a talk with Gabriel about the Whisperers and how people unravel when they're afraid. Outside, Gabriel seems to freak out over the thought of the Whisperers, causing more panic, to which a boom doesn't help. Last scenario is at a dock where Daryl and Ezekiel are waiting. A boat arrives with many aboard, including Carol, who seems to have no interest in talking to her hubby. She gives him the cold shoulder and runs off with Daryl. They go on a road trip where they talk about running away together, saying the constant fighting is getting tiresome. Just as Daryl declares Carol to be his new best friend, a loud boom is heard. The scenarios accumulate onto a crash site of the satellite where it caused a large forest fire, and all the groups converge to try to put it out before it spreads. The fire is on Whisperer territory, but they decide the risk is worth it if it keeps Oceanside safe. They work throughout the night and into the next morning. Eugene convinces Michonne to let him take some of the satellite back with them, while Daryl and Carol go off on a walk. Daryl convinces her to stay, and the episode ends with Alpha coming out of the forest and spotting Carol. Alright then, so this episode is kind of a patchwork of ideas and concepts from the comics from over the course of many issues pieced together. First and foremost, there's no satellite or forest fire, so we can just skip over all that mess. That whole setup was just an excuse for Carol to dumbfoundingly stumble into kicking off a war with the Whisperers. This is also in part how the episode got its name, Lines We Cross. At face value, it simply means the group has crossed the territorial line into Whisperer area. However, there seems to be a deeper meaning into each group of the scenarios. Aaron has a discussion with Michonne, asking her if she thinks they're the good guys, implying they've crossed the line several times and could be seen as the bad guys in the eyes of those they fought.
Michonne.
Yeah.
Are we the good guys?
Spoiler alert, Rick has done some really messed up stuff in the fight with the Saviors. This is a reference to the comic with the same title as the show, where Rick explains to Maggie that though Negan is a bad guy, in some ways they're really no better. During the talk with Negan and Gabriel, Negan is talking about the lines people cross when they're afraid, moving others into the them category as an excuse to have someone to blame and direct their anger at. A similar conversation is had in the comics between Negan and Rick around the same timeline as the show. Lastly, with Carol, a line was crossed with her when she failed to keep Henry safe, and she handles it the same way Michonne does in the comic after she lost Ezekiel. The show's name came from issue 169 of the comics, also titled Lines We Cross, though that issue actually happens after the Whisperer War, a bit later than where the show's at right now. Just like in the show, several survivors reflect back on times where they crossed the line and how it shaped who they become. Carl tells Lydia of the time he killed Ben. Rick crossed the line with Maggie by letting Negan live, and she in turn crosses the line by having Negan followed so she can go kill him herself. In the previous issue, Rick killed Dwight's love, Sherry, forcing him to cross the line with Rick by demanding he step down from leadership and appoint Dwight in charge. The first part of this episode shows several at Oceanside doing militaristic training on a beach, preparing them to work together to fight the dead. This appears to be influenced from the comics where a similar militia is formed, but leaves out the build-up to why it was created. The communities are falling apart at the perceived inaction of Rick. The anger takes to new heights when someone tries to kill Rick. Taking the advice of Negan, Rick decides to direct everyone's fear and anger away from each other and focus it on the Whisperers. He creates a militia as a smokescreen to give the impression that everyone is now safe. The militia starts training under the command of Dwight with formations and cooperation similar to what we saw on the beach. Next up, when Gabriel hears the news of Whisperers being back, he seems even more traumatized by it. After the council meeting, he goes and has a talk with Negan. A similar conversation took place in the comics, but between Negan and Rick, though under a bit different circumstances. In the show, Negan asks Gabriel to listen to his advice. However, in the comics, it's Rick who seeks out Negan's help. Seeing the communities fall apart with fear and turning against each other as well as Rick, he goes to Negan for help.
Why don't you just nestle in below me and let me baby bird a little bit of my wisdom into that pretty little mouth of yours.
Negan's advice is to use the proverbial us versus them.
Proverbial semi-us category to the category of them.
He goes on to say leaders make up threats all the time to stay in power, and with the Whisperers, Rick has the best us versus them situation ever. Rick tells him his people are calling for action, and blind action will only get people killed. Negan corrects him by saying they're not calling for action, they're calling for security.
Now you ask me, you gotta make them feel secure, even if it's just for show.
So all Rick has to do is make them feel secure, but Rick refuses to lie to his people.
So, you're telling me to lie?
Negan tells him he doesn't need to lie, but just manipulate the truth to make people feel more secure. As long as it keeps people alive, what's the harm?
Think of it as using the truth to manipulate, but hell, at the end of the day, if that's what keeps people alive, what's the harm?
Interesting though, unlike AMC's timeline, Negan is never allowed out. Now in the comics, Rick's method to make people feel secure is to form the militia, but in AMC, the militia appears to be already formed, so it's going to be interesting to see how Gabriel does, or what he does, to kind of take Negan's advice and what he does to make people feel more secure. While AMC doesn't show when Carol left, we know she became a pirate at some point after Henry was killed. This concept was also taken from the comics. Sometime after the war with the Saviors, Michonne takes off without saying a word. Just after Magna's group arrived and right before the fair started, Michonne returns on a fishing boat to awaiting Rick and Ezekiel. She was in a relationship with Ezekiel, but when she docks, Michonne seems to want nothing to do with him. Rick talks to her and she opens up about her past and feeling guilty about losing her daughter, saying she feels as though she was getting a do-over and couldn't handle that. AMC seemed to use that concept with Carol and the loss of Henry, though with Daryl in Rick's place, and since he's gone. Also interesting is a good chunk of the dialogue between Carol and Daryl was directly taken from Michonne and Rick.
I'm a sea dog, man. Get off my ass before I put you on yours.
Sorry if I didn't want my best friend to spend her whole life on a boat.
Best friend? What are you, Zen?
Whatever.
Should we have matching bracelets now?
Michonne had no plans of staying, but she came home the same day as the fair, and the events from there sort of made it impossible for her to leave. The last little bit is the whole forest fire scene and the survivors crossing into Whisperer territory, ending with the Carol and Alpha scene. This part I honestly don't get. Carol knows the risks of them being spotted by Alpha in their territory, but she ignores them anyway. She just stands there and stares her down instead of, maybe ducking and hiding and reporting back to the others that the Whisperers are back so they can have a strategic advantage. But no, she just stands there and does nothing. It's honestly the dumbest, sorry AMC, this is one of the dumbest ideas and concepts you guys ever had. I know why they did it. They did it because they want to have some Carol part of some way of initiating the war with the Whisperers, but honestly, it's lazy writing. They could have done it another way. The whole fighting with the Whisperers kicks off way differently in the comics. In there, Negan escapes his cell and goes to find the Whisperers. Initially, he says he wants to join them, but when he gets alone with Alpha, his true motives come out. Going after him, Michonne and Aaron cross into their lands and are caught by Beta. These two acts are what kicks off the next chapter of the Whisperer War, and is what's coming next in AMC's timeline. See, the comics makes more sense. It's kind of more plausible how this would happen. Negan is kind of, he's set in his own ways. They're not deranged, but he's not thinking, I don't know if you want to say clearly or logically, but in his mind, he's doing the greater good. And Michonne and Aaron, they're trying to stop him, so it's more fluid for them to cross into the territory, knowing the risks, to go after him. And they get surprised and caught. In AMC's version, it really doesn't make much sense for, I mean, I know they want to go and fight the fire and all that, but wouldn't it make more sense for them to go to Oceanside and create a barrier between Oceanside and the fire and fight it there and stop it there and let it burn out on the Whisperer side?
We need to backburn the stray fuel by the control line so the fire can't spread.
I wish they would have handled it a lot differently. I'm going to end these videos a little bit differently with some things I hated and some things I liked. First, I've hated how slow this premiere episode was. I mean, I get it. They're trying to set up for the story arc coming and the whole upcoming war and all that, and they need to do the build up and set the pieces in place. But for a season premiere opening, it was incredibly slow. There were some parts scattered here and there, but overall, it was just too slow for my liking. I've also hated everything they've done with Carol. The whole she's gone and she comes back and she's distant and she's a pirate, and how she handled Alpha. She's supposed to be one of the smartest characters in terms of like strategy and strategic planning and all that, but they made her kind of a buffoon at the end with how she handled Alpha's interaction, but I've spoken enough on that. Now, some things I loved. Well, I'm kind of mixed as far as how they introduced the militia, if that's actually the same militia in the comics. I loved how they look. It's more realistic to me than the ones in the comics. In the comics, the militia, they have an endless supply of bullets, like they have a cheat code for it or something. In the world without Dick's Sporting Goods and gun shops and all that, they seem to have an endless supply of bullets for every type of gun out there. I mean, I know Eugene's making them, but it's kind of silly with how much they go through. In the show, however, they seem to be training more with like shields, melee weapons, rocks, slings, spears. It's more realistic that they're going to conserve ammunition for the real threat and practice with melee weapons that are endless. I've also loved Aaron's speech to Michonne. I've been thinking this for years and years now. AMC presents Rick and his groups as the good guys, and quite frankly, I'm sick of it. And I'm glad a character in the show has recognized they're honestly not the good guys.
Are we the good guys?
They're surviving, they're doing what they have to, but they've done a lot of messed up stuff in the show. I mean, just as an example, how could you call them the good guys when they sneak into a satellite tower while people are sleeping and murder everyone in their sleep? They didn't know Negan was in there 100%. They didn't know if half the people they killed were janitors and cooks. They just made the assumption that they're all fighters and they're all part of his army and all that, and they butcher everyone in their sleep. That's not what a good guy does. So I'm glad somebody in the show finally recognized that in the eyes of others, they can be seen as the villains. Because honestly, for the past 4 seasons, that's how I've seen them, as the villains. I mean, look at the villains from the show in the past. The Vatos were the first bad guys, but they turned out to be good guys just trying to protect nursing home residents. The governor, while definitely corrupted by power, he was the good guy in the eyes of the people of Woodbury. Gareth and his people were incredibly weak, could not hunt, but they were smart. They didn't see themselves as the bad guys, but only humans trying to survive with the skills they had. And certainly the other cops in Atlanta didn't think of Don as the bad guy, but only somebody who had to be strong and strict to keep the hospital residents alive. And if you know Negan's backstory, he's certainly not a bad guy at the core, but only somebody who thought people were innately weak, and he had to do what had to be done to ensure they lived. Well, I'll leave things here for now. We're officially in Season 10. If they continue to go along with the main points of the comic, things are going to really start to pick up. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and until next time, keep on whispering.